The strike never landed. According to witnesses, it simply ceased to exist somewhere between intention and impact, not blocked, not deflected, but dissolved into irrelevance by something they could not name. The man who threw it, a seasoned instructor with 2 decades of traditional training, would later insist he had no memory of falling. One moment, he was attacking with lethal intent. Next, he was staring at warehouse rafters, wondering why he could not breathe. 36 students saw it happen. None could adequately explain what they had witnessed. Their descriptions varied in detail, but converged on a single point of bewilderment. Their teacher had not appeared to move, not in any way that mattered. Yet somehow, impossibly, a full-power strike from a trained fighter had been neutralized with such minimal effort that several observers were not certain anything had happened at all. The teacher was Bruce Lee, though his reputation in early 1970 had not yet transcended the insular world of martial arts instruction. To the students gathered in that Chinatown warehouse, he was simply Sifu, an innovator whose fusion approach attracted both devoted followers and virulent skeptics. The man on the floor represented the latter category. He had come to expose what he believed was an elaborate deception. Instead, according to multiple accounts, he had exposed something else entirely: the terrifying possibility that everything he knew about combat was wrong. The evening had begun as a routine training session, private instruction for serious students, with no spectators and no documentation. Lee's teaching method emphasized principle over technique, efficiency over tradition. He was demonstrating Chi Sao, sticky hands, a sensitivity drill that develops the ability to read an opponent through touch. To observers, it resembled a gentle dance of touching forearms. To practitioners, it was a constant negotiation of pressure and structure, each participant seeking advantage through the subtlest adjustments of angle and force. The visiting instructor had watched from the periphery for 40 minutes, his skepticism hardening into open disdain. According to witnesses, his posture radiated the particular contempt of someone whose certainties were being threatened. His own school, built on traditional forms and rigid hierarchies, had been losing students to this new approach. He had come to see the fraud for himself. What he saw instead was his own students, former students, training with an intensity he had never inspired. During a water break, the challenge came. The visitor's words, as recalled by those present, cut through casual conversation with calculated precision. He questioned whether these sensitivity games had any genuine application, whether all this talk of formless form and intercepting energy was anything more than mysticism packaged for Western consumption, whether Lee himself could demonstrate real effectiveness against someone who was not playing along. The warehouse fell silent. Not the mere absence of sound, witnesses reported, but something denser, an atmospheric shift that made breathing feel deliberate. Lee set down his water cup with the kind of careful precision that suggested he was buying time to make a decision. Several students noted a subtle change in his stance, a settling of weight that transformed his casual posture into something more fundamental. He invited the challenger to join him. What followed began as Chi Sao but became something witnesses would spend years trying to understand. They stood in the classical position, arms crossed at the wrists, maintaining the light contact that allows each practitioner to read the other's intention through touch. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing visible occurred. But those familiar with the exercise could see the microscopic negotiations of pressure, the constant probing for structural weakness, the silent conversation conducted through points of contact. The visiting instructor's frustration manifested physically. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the warehouse's cool temperature. His jaw clenched with the effort of trying to find an opening through Lee's relaxed guard. According to multiple accounts, Lee's only words during this phase were barely audible. "You're fighting yourself." The first attack came without warning, a sudden thrust designed to penetrate Lee's centerline. Witnesses described the counter as so minimal that several were uncertain whether anything had occurred. A slight rotation of Lee's wrist redirected the incoming force, sending the attacker stumbling forward, unbalanced by his own commitment. He reset, tried again with greater aggression. Lee's response remained maddeningly gentle, yielding to pressure only to reappear in its path, using the attacker's force to create increasingly unstable positions. By the third exchange, the visitor had abandoned all pretense of training. According to witnesses, his final attack was delivered with genuine malice, a full-speed strike aimed at Lee's head, thrown with the intent to cause real damage. There was no telegraph, no warning, just sudden violence born of humiliation. What happened next lasted less than a second, but would be dissected for decades. Lee's hand, which had been in gentle contact with the attacker's wrist, seemed to simply continue its existing motion. No acceleration was visible, no obvious exertion. Yet that minimal movement proved sufficient not only to redirect the strike, but to guide the attacker's momentum into complete structural collapse. The visiting instructor's feet left the ground in a graceless tangle. He hit the concrete hard, shoulder first, the impact driving air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. Lee stepped back immediately. Several witnesses noted what appeared to be genuine distress on his face. This was not the clean demonstration of principle he taught. This was something rawer, more primal, the kind of crude display he typically criticized. The man on the floor was not physically injured beyond bruising, but something else had been broken. His entire understanding of combat efficacy had been dismantled in public view. According to those present, Lee moved to help him up, to check for injury, to restore some dignity to the moment. The gesture was refused with a sharp shake of the head. The visitor gathered himself, straightened his uniform, and walked toward the exit without speaking. The doors closing echoed through the space like punctuation. The remaining students stood frozen, processing what they had witnessed. Their teacher, who constantly emphasized control and restraint, had allowed something unscripted to intrude into the careful structure of training. When Lee finally spoke, witnesses recalled weariness in his voice. This is why we train control, not to limit our effectiveness, but to preserve the possibility of teaching. The session resumed, but the energy had fundamentally shifted. Students performed the prescribed movements while their minds replayed that moment of uncontrolled reality. Questions hung unasked. Had their teacher lost control or demonstrated its ultimate expression? Was the visitor's humiliation a failure of the method or its vindication? In subsequent weeks, the story spread through martial arts circles with inevitable distortions. Some versions had Lee deliberately provoking the confrontation. Others suggested the visitor had been sent by rivals to test or embarrass him. The participants maintained silence, perhaps understanding that their accounts would only fuel speculation. The visiting instructor never returned to teaching. His school closed within 2 months. Years later, someone claiming to be his former student suggested he had quit not from shame, but from revelation. That in that moment of failed attack and effortless counter, he had glimpsed something that made his previous understanding obsolete. Whether this was truth or retroactive mythology remains unclear. Lee himself, according to those closest to him, never spoke publicly of the incident. In private, some claimed, he expressed regret, not for the outcome, but for allowing the situation to escalate beyond instruction. The warehouse sessions continued with new protocols. Visitors were screened more carefully. Challenges were redirected into structured exchanges with predetermined limits. But something had been lost in that moment of unscripted reality. The students who witnessed it reported a change in their teacher, a heightened wariness, a reluctance to demonstrate certain principles at full expression. He had shown them inadvertently the gap between training and application. That gap, once revealed, could never be fully closed. Documentation remains frustratingly incomplete. No photographs exist of that evening. The warehouse was demolished years later. Many witnesses have passed away, their accounts preserved only in fragments. The visiting instructor's name appears in no official records, as if erased by mutual agreement. Modern practitioners debate whether the encounter occurred as described or has been inflated through retelling. Skeptics cite the lack of evidence, the convenient absence of documentation, and the mythic quality of the narrative. But those who were present insist on the essential truth. They remember the sound of impact, the quality of silence that followed, the way their teacher's hands trembled slightly as he gathered equipment at the session's end. These details, they argue, are too specific for fabrication. The warehouse stood empty for years before demolition, avoided by the local martial arts community, as if contaminated by that moment of uncontrolled reality. Local instructors would cross the street rather than walk past its loading dock, as if proximity might invoke a similar loss of control. The incident's significance lies not in what can be proven, but in what it represents. It serves as a cautionary tale about boundaries between demonstration and application, between teaching and proving, between control and its abandonment. Every practitioner must eventually confront these boundaries. Most do so privately. But on that night, according to witnesses, one man's confrontation played out before dozens of eyes, leaving marks on everyone present. The visiting instructor was reportedly seen once more, years later, in a martial arts supply store several cities away. A former student approached, eager to reconnect. The man looked through him as if he were transparent, completed his purchase, and left without acknowledgement. He moved, the student noted, with the careful precision of someone who had learned to never fully commit their weight. As for Lee, he continued refining and spreading his methods until circumstances ended his journey prematurely. The warehouse incident became one more story among many, each claiming to reveal an essential truth about the man and his art. But those present that night knew they had witnessed something different from usual demonstrations. They had seen for just a moment what happens when the boundary between practice and reality dissolves without warning. The exact date remains disputed. The location, beyond a Chinatown warehouse, was never recorded. The challenger's name exists in no written record. Yet decades later, aging practitioners still lower their voices when discussing that night, as if speaking too loudly might summon similar uncontrolled revelation. They remember not technique or theory, but the sound of a body hitting concrete and the silence that followed. A silence suggesting everyone had witnessed something that should not have happened, something that questioned the careful distinctions between demonstration and reality they had all agreed to maintain. Perhaps that is why the story persists despite lacking documentation. It reminds us that beneath every controlled technique lies potential for something less refined, but more honest. And sometimes, according to those who claim they witnessed it, that potential manifests whether we intend it or not. The students who were there that night went on to become instructors themselves, but none would demonstrate that particular principle Lee had inadvertently revealed, the dissolution of an attack through pure structural superiority. It was, they understood, too dangerous to teach. Some knowledge can only be witnessed, never transmitted. The warehouse district was eventually transformed into commercial developments and trendy lofts. But local martial artists still speak of that night, when their teacher showed them something he had not meant to show, when the careful boundary between what we practice and what we might need was breached for just long enough to reveal the terrifying efficiency that lies beneath all the philosophy and control. They had seen, in that fragment of a second, why some knowledge must remain undemonstrated, not because it lacks validity, but because its validity is too absolute to be safely shared. Those who were present that night carried the memory like a secret burden, understanding that they had witnessed not just a man falling, but an entire worldview collapsing in real time. And perhaps most disturbing of all, they had seen it happen through an action so minimal that some observers were not certain their teacher had moved at all.